So welcome, there are a few folk just about to make their way in, but let's get underway. And while I think of it, let me just give you a heads up for next month. There's no Dean's Forum in August because there's the Conference of Australian Deans up in Brisbane that weekend, so I'm out of action that weekend. But also because it's the Lay Ministers Conference for Grafton Diocese and it's happening here on that Saturday and Sunday. I'm not sure what that means in terms of LLM involvement in the Sunday service that day, but presumably between you and Judy and Tiffany and so on, will be well catered for in terms of whatever has to happen that day. So there's no Dean's Forum in August. Then we'll have September, October, November, and then by December I will be in Jerusalem, so I won't be doing a Dean's Forum that day either. Because it would be about 4 a.m. over there at the moment. That might be a bit early for me to live stream a little video chat for you. And besides that, the internet's probably really poor. So what we're doing today, this is a topic which has really risen out of requests from people in the group. It was actually Kay's particular suggestion. There were a couple of meetings back that it would be good to have some time to unpack some of the questions about, so how much is historical and how much are stories and how does all that work in terms of meaning and significance and so on. So we have touched on that, of course, particularly the sessions where we've looked at the formation of the Gospels and so on. We've talked about the interplay of different sources and how Matthew is a revised edition of Mark, and then Luke comes along and says, actually, I don't like any of your work, and says, I can do it better, and so on. So we've got layer upon layer of redaction or editing and revision going on. But I thought this would be a good chance just to stand back from it, as it were, and look at the big picture. So again, as always, feel free to interrupt at any point, and feel free to throw $100 bills or whatever, which the organist will leap upon to put into the Cathedral fund. Okay. So let's get underway. So the image that's up there happens to be a New Testament papyrus. This one's papyrus number 76. And as it happens, this is the first line of John's Gospel. And what we've got here is Evangelion Kata Yohanan. So John's Gospel, but it's got the last paragraph of Luke's Gospel. So this is one of those, P76 it's only one piece of parchment, but it has on it a tiny, like the Luke 24 verses whatever, 45 to 50 or something, and then it has John chapter 1, and you can see there's no verse numbers, there's no chapter numbers. This is what this stuff looked like in the 2nd and 3rd century. It's handwritten, and also, generally speaking, it's all written in capitals, and there's no punctuation, and there are no gaps between the words. All right? Because what they most cared about was somebody speaking it. This was just in case you forgot and you needed to be reminded. So you already knew what was going to be there, so you knew where to put the word breaks and so on. Okay? So just to remind you of how that what the text looked like. Now the kind of questions we've found ourselves, and we often find ourselves asking, are things like, so what does this text, what does this word, what does this phrase mean? I think it was last Sunday after church, somebody was saying, when Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead, what does that mean? Okay? At one level, the words are straightforward, but dead people can't bury dead people, so clearly it's not a literal. The meaning of that aphorism is not going to be found in the black and white meaning of the words, because let the dead bury the dead, the first lot of dead is a different category from the second lot. They're only dead in some sense. They're not dead in the sense that the other group of people are. So it's a bit of a pun, and like one of the things Jesus was particularly good at was throwing out a one-liner which left people thinking, what does he mean by that?
I've been thinking for years.
Yeah, is he being rude? I mean, what's he saying? Okay, and so again, all of that will help us get a sense, so how does the Bible work? The Bible is not simply a manual with all the answers to life's questions or even all the answers to the church's questions. Okay? Because a lot of the things in the Bible leave us scratching our chin and thinking, what does that mean? What am I going to do with that? And even when we know what it means, there's still the question of, so what am I going to do about it? Which, of course, can be a different thing. Did that really happen? Okay. Did Pharaoh's army really drown itself in the Red Sea? Okay. And so on. Okay. Etc., etc. There are lots and lots of things. Did Jesus say that? This is particularly, I would say, a live issue in the Gospel of John, because the Jesus we get in John's Gospel sounds so very different from the Jesus we get in Matthew, Mark and Luke. In John he talks about himself and he gives long speeches. In Matthew, Mark and Luke he talks about the kingdom of God and he has little sound bites, parables, aphorisms, one-liners, and hardly ever talks about himself. So what's going on there? And so we've got to have some explanation for that. Similarly, did God do that? Did God really command the Israelites to go and slaughter all the Canaanites? Or in the case, slaughter the men, take the women and children as booty, okay, as sex slaves? Did God really command the Hebrews to do that? Or is that the ancient tribes thinking this is what we're going to do, so we're going to say God told us to do it? Okay? Because a God who would, by our lights these days, a God who would command ethnic cleansing is a God we might have some problems with. Okay? Who did write the Bible anyway? What was her name? Well, actually, probably most of the people writing the Bible were blokes because they did not waste education on girls in the ancient world, generally speaking. Okay? So we're in a different space. When was it written? We'll do a little bit of that today. Who chose the contents of the Bible? Who decided what's in the Bible, what's out of the Bible? Again, that's the sort of questions that come up from time to time, and we'll touch base on that. What about the people before Abraham? Now, in the Bible, if you add up all the dates, as Bishop Ussher from Ireland did about 300 years ago, if you add up all the genealogies, you get the world being made in October the year 4004 BC, which means the Australian Aborigines had already been here for 56,000 years before God created Adam and Eve. So we see there's a problem here. We've got other information that tells us that it was a bit more complicated than the way the Hebrew tribes and the Jewish people were telling the story. And of course, what about other religions? Well, depending where you're coming from on the Anglican map, that's a very easy question to answer. They're all going to hell. But if you're from Grafton Cathedral, you probably don't take that point of view. You probably think God loves everybody and has a generous purpose for everybody, and nothing is going to stop God's purposes from being fulfilled. That's surely one of the messages of Easter. You can do your worst to me, but in the end, my best will prevail. That's part of the dynamic, and we're still trying to work that out because so much of our religion is tribal. My God's bigger than your God. My miracles actually happen. Yours are just fables. All that kind of schoolyard stuff. And of course, really, the only question in a way that matters is, how do I respond to this passage? Not did it happen, or was it that big, or were there that many people, whatever, but the really important question is, how am I responding to this passage? And this gets us to the power of story. I just want to touch on this very briefly. It's a common thing these days at schools, but still strangely missing in the life of the church, to appreciate the power of story. So people sometimes play with the fact that we describe our species as Homo sapiens, but others have suggested we're really Homo narratus. We are the people who tell stories. And as we tell stories, we create ourselves. And again, NAIDOC week, the Aboriginal people would tell us the story creates the people. And they tell the story of how the world, the country came to be. And we know the power of mass media. And just in the last couple of months, some of us were reading this book, The Freedom Artist, which was a weird book to read in some ways, turned out. But at the heart of this story, this novel, is the idea that imagine a world where the government, the hierarchy running the world, put out a consistent story, which actually wasn't true, but it was consistently promoted. And anybody who deviated from that story was exterminated. Okay? And no, don't think about China, and don't think about Google, and don't think about it, because it would never happen, would it? Okay? The power of the story. The stories we tell each other. Why is it so hard for people like me to really believe that the first European settlers murdered the indigenous people? Because the story I grew up on said it wasn't like that. Okay? So we have to change the story if we're going to have a better understanding of how things are. So, how do texts work? And this is what I started saying a moment ago. Throughout all the schools, whether it's Grafton or anywhere else, kids are learning to engage in what we call genre studies, and they're really discovering and becoming quite skilled in making sense of the media and of other stories, and asking who's telling this story, who's going to benefit from this story if I buy into the story, and so on. And how do stories work in terms of the way they shape our imagination? So it's very common in schools and so on, but it's pretty sadly lacking in most pulpits, in most churches. Meaning, we've come to realise, meaning and truth, but meaning is negotiated between the author and the reader. The reader could be one person, or the reader could be a congregation, hearing the story, reading the story together. Okay? And meaning is something we create. In fact, although the author tries to steer the reader to a particular outcome, it doesn't work. We determine what the story means. We read the story from our point of view, in our context, we make sense of it, we decide what it means. The reader is the one with all the power. And that's exactly the same for the Bible. But almost everybody who quotes the Bible as a weapon in debate in the media about homosexuality, for example, or debates in the church about the same kinds of issues, they're working on the basis if the Bible says it, that's it. That is not how texts work. The Bible says it, and we have to read it and make something out of it. Then we have meaning. Then we have, hopefully, truth. So we determine what any text, even the Bible, means. So our concept of what inspiration means has to take that into account as well. It's not that God inspires the author to say what has to be said for the truth to be captured. What God has to do is to inspire the reader to make sense of the text and get to an outcome that perhaps God is happy for us to reach. So the relationship between text and reader is somewhat different than perhaps we've grown up thinking. So file that one away for conversation today or some other point. And of course, if the Bible was self-explicating, if the Bible explained itself and established the truth, there would not be so many different interpretations of the Bible and of Christianity. The fact that everybody who reads the Bible and every Christian, like there are 10, 12 different denominations in town, they're all reading the Bible and they're all coming up with a different meaning. Well, of course, because meaning is determined by the reader, not by the text. Okay? This idea that the text tells us what to think is wrong. The text suggests how we might choose to think. But it's up to us what meaning we create. So let's go back to the texts themselves. One of the things we need to do, we can't cover all this today, of course, is that if we're going to have a kind of grown-up attitude towards the Bible, we need some appreciation of how the text came to exist in the first place. And so they're books, they're physical books. We just saw a photograph of one of the ancient manuscripts from the 2nd or 3rd century, P76. P76 did not drop out of heaven. Somebody sat at some kind of desk appropriate to the culture and the technology of the 2nd, 3rd century, and they used ink, which somebody had learned to make, and they used a writing tool, some kind of pen, on which they could attach a little drop of ink. So all of this, it's a technology. Okay? The culture of bookmaking is part of the process. So books did not drop out of heaven, and they were not dictated by the Holy Spirit. What they do require is the development of literature, writing technology, and a social system that has some spare people to waste on literature. Okay? Where were the rest? Out in the fields growing food. But when you get wealthy enough and you create a surplus, then you can afford to have a priest. And one of the things a priest does is they keep records. They learn to read the stars and work out when it's harvest time and when's the right time to do festivals and so on. And humans came to believe it was useful to assign a certain percentage of the population to those kind of activities. They also were the ones who ran the tax system for the king, because you need people who can count. Okay, and remember, he's got quite a lot of sheep. So we've got to make sure next time at lambing season, go around to Alan's place, because we're going to need to nick some of his lambs. It's no good going to his, he's a hopeless farmer, but you've got lots of lambs, so we're going to come to your place when it's tax time. Okay, so this is the role of the scribe. And the scribe is simply a word meaning someone that can write. By the way, clergy, comes from another word meaning someone who can write, clerk. Someone who can write, because in the pre-modern English system, if you were lucky, the parson was the person in town who was literate. Mostly they just memorised the service, okay? But in theory, the parson was the clerk in holy orders. He was the one person in town who could read and write. Same idea, okay? So we find a process as we go from papyrus, single pieces of paper, to somebody figuring out if I joined all these bits of paper together and stitch them really carefully, I can make a piece of paper that I roll up to be a scroll. Okay, but of course I'm not going to read the scroll starting over here. N, arche, ain, hol, logos, chi, hol, logos. That's not going to work. So you're going to divide the scroll up into columns, and you're just going to go dung, 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 and then you'll roll your way through the scroll. We, of course, still use the technology. We scroll down a computer screen. Okay, the same concept is still there. Then they learned they could chop the scroll up into separate leaves again, stack them on top of each other, stitch one side. Look, Mum, I just created the book, the codex, which was really handy for travellers. Okay, whereas the scrolls were kind of cumbersome. Proper books, religious books, went on scrolls. Other books went on to codices. The earliest Christians, being innovative people, as Christians, were early adopters of the codex. It was cheap and nasty, like a cheap paperback, okay? But they were much more economical than scrolls. So once upon a time, Christians were innovators. And then, of course, they decided, let's not waste our time with expensive books that have a whole lot of bits of the Bible we don't actually read. Let's just have a lectionary that has just the bits we're going to use in church. And in fact, most of the ancient copies of the Bible are lectionaries, not Bibles. Because that's how people use the Bible. nobody was that excited about having a copy of Leviticus. So this reminds us to think about what books were like before the printing press. Okay, A, they're expensive. B, most people weren't literate. Okay, so how did books function prior to Gutenberg? Okay, and then of course the other question is, what are books becoming after the iPad? Okay, some of us hardly ever buy a book anymore, okay, which is why bookshops are going broke. It also means if you're looking at your Bible on an iPad and you've done a search for Romans 8, you will only see Romans 8. Your eye will not accidentally see the last paragraph of Romans 7 or the first paragraph of Romans 9. Okay, so how we encounter the Bible will change because of technology. So, how was the Bible determined? Well, we've actually got various sets of Bibles. We have, of course, a Jewish Bible only contains what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures. We have Greek and Latin Bibles. We have this whole family of Bibles done in sort of Slavic languages, or Slavonic languages, which is basically Eastern Europe, north of Greece, south of Russia, including Russia. We've got Oriental Bibles, which we don't know much about, but that's places like Ethiopia and Syria and so on, where Bibles look a bit different from ours. And then we have modern Bibles, as in Reformation onwards type Bibles, which also tend to be printed Bibles. Okay. So when we say the Bible says, we often forget to say whose Bible. We're talking about the Armenian Bible, or the Coptic Bible, an Anglican Bible, a Protestant Bible, they're not the same thing, by the way, a Roman Catholic Bible, etc. Okay? It's not the case that there is one Bible. The Bible exists in many cultural variations. And the decisions about what to include or exclude was basically based on what the churches were using. If we're using it, we want it in the Bible. If we're not using it, it disappears. Okay? And obviously there are differences as well between Jewish Bibles and Christian Bibles, partly on that basis. Okay. So, what a text is, how it gets produced, who determines what's in it, and then the question of how the Bible has been read. So in the case of the Bible, we have more than 2,000 years of interpretation. People have been reading these texts for a long time, and they've been generating secondary literature. For the Jewish people, it's the Mishnah and the Talmud. For Christians, it's commentaries and other discussions of biblical and theological themes. So what we have access to is this amazing, rich mix, which is interfaith, because it includes Jewish Bible scholarship as well as Christian Bible scholarship. It's ecumenical, because particularly in the last 100 years or so, biblical scholarship is no longer done by Protestants and Catholics or whatever. It's people just work together on these projects. There are still denominational approaches. There are some Christian communities which will only recommend a particular translation. Which I was surprised last Sunday night that there was the person leading the service at New Life Church apologised because he wasn't using the New King James Version. And I had to resist myself from saying, "Thanks be to God!" He would have been really excited if I stood up and raised my hands. For heaven's sake, the New King James Version? That's a travesty. But we do have tribal variations where people want to use a particular version because it suits their own bias. That's what that's about. Okay? And then, of course, we have partisan translations and partisan Bible scholarship, which is built around particular controversies, particular points of view. And, of course, 1,000 years ago, if you were doing serious Bible study, it looked like that. And today it looks like this. Okay, I triple click on a Greek word, I get it takes me straight away to the lexicon. To the lexicon, which gives me access to all the ancient examples of where that word was used, so that I can try and work out what the meaning of the word might be. Maps, blah blah blah. So how the Bible is being read is changing over time, and of course, as we move into a multimedia streaming world, the idea of picking up a book and devoting hours a day reading a book is just so 1960. No one's going to do that. The younger ones are just not going to do that. Okay? So the Bible is changing to a different space. So that's irrespective of whether the stuff in the Bible happened. That's just some perspectives on how texts work, how the Bible came to be, and how the Bible itself has been a focal for literally hundreds of generations of dedicated scholarship, interfaith, ecumenical, trans-denominational, etc. So now let's go to the question of historicity. This, by the way, is the only image of a literate woman from the ancient world. So I love this picture. She's got a wax tablet, which is the old-fashioned version of a writing notepad, because it's a wax tablet. In fact, it's several pieces of wax tablet tied together with a bit of string on the side. Sometimes they were, as here, very thin slices of timber, which were then covered in wax. So you use the stylus to make your notes. When you don't need those notes anymore, you simply put your little book out in the sun for a few minutes, the wax all melts, and it's ready to use again. When I was a kid growing up, we had these things where you could write with a stick, and then you lifted up the sheet of plastic and it all disappeared. And it's that kind of technology. Now, in fact, we've found hundreds of these at an archaeological dig in the UK. So we know that around the end of the first century, these were very popular. So she's got her stylus, she's poised in thought and the artist's imagination, but she has her little collection of timber, some pieces of timber tied together in the corner, and would have been covered in wax, and she's about to make. Now, you don't use this technology for something you want to go back to in 5 years' time. This is the back of the envelope kind of shopping list. Okay? A lovely, lovely image. Clearly, this woman, or the person who's being represented in this piece of work, is from an elite family. Village girls, A, didn't look like that, and B, didn't get enough education to be able to read and write. So she's representing a woman from a wealthy elite family. And her image has survived for 2,000 years, which is lovely. So let's make a list. Let's take her to heart. We're going to make a list. So I'm just going to put up a whole series of characters that occur in the biblical narrative. And I want you to indicate when you think we're dealing with historical characters and what date you would assign. If they're historical, they will have a date and a place. Okay? So we'll start with Adam and Eve. I don't have a date or a place for them. Okay? Nice story, but I don't have a date or a place.
Wasn't Mesopotamia?
Sorry?
Wasn't Mesopotamia?
Well, the story reflects a Mesopotamian culture rather than a Canaanite culture.
Yeah. And they say, I think the rivers,
But there is no place in the Mediterranean with rivers on four sides and a wonderful paradisical garden. So it's a never land. It's a mythical land. So it's once upon a time in a faraway place there was this magical garden, which was the whole world, apparently, and it's surrounded by four mighty rivers, two of which are the Tigris and Euphrates, but the other two don't exist. The ones running east-west don't exist. But people telling the story didn't know that. So it's a beautiful story, and it's not to be thrown out because it's not historical, but these are not. And what we know from science is that the first Eve, the ancestor of all humans, probably a woman in Africa, okay, and not a couple in Mesopotamia. So we're not dealing with history yet. Noah and the flood. We've got a carpenter. We've got a boat builder. So we've got culture, we've got technology.
There wasn't an historic flood
One.
way back when, but I have no idea when.
One. There were lots. If you live, these are stories coming out of Mesopotamia. They had floods every year.
A big one.
Okay, well we have 1 in 100-year floods as well, which sometimes
I think
happen
a bigger
faster.
one.
Well, then we get to the question. Okay, so this was the flood that didn't just wipe out the Clarence, but it wiped out the Kimberleys as well. Well, there are no such floods like that. Don't exist. Okay, so is this a historic orbit? And given that we have flood stories in many different cultures around the world, that does not mean that there was once upon a time a flood. But these stories come out of different river civilizations, all of which had periodic floods. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus, the Ganges, China, and so on. These are massive incubators of human civilization, and they all had disaster stories because if you build a city on a floodplain, Brisbane, every 10 years you're going to have a dirty big flood and wipe everybody out. And every now and then you're going to have a super duper flood.
I want to
Yeah.
builders.
So Noah and the flood, we certainly can't put a date to it, but we can recognise it as echoing a pattern. Okay, and in fact, when archaeologists have dug up the layers of silt deposited by giant floods, even in Mesopotamia, they're not from the same time periods. So there are places where the silt is this deep, but they're not from the same period in history. Okay, so no, this is not history. Okay, this is a story about the way stuff is around here. And every now and then there's going to be a massive flood, and you better be ready for it. Abraham and Sarah. Now we're getting down to people with families and children and locations we can address. Okay, but actually we can't put dates on Abraham and Sarah either. The dates in the Bible would suggest somewhere around 2200 BCE, but the names in the story are first millennium names, younger than 1000 BC. Those names weren't being used 1,000 years earlier. So there's something going on here, but it ain't history. Moses, Exodus, Pharaoh. Well, it's not history either. Okay? Think about it. Egypt is one of those massive river civilizations, and when things were going well in Egypt, they controlled everything up the coast of Palestine, as far as the top end of the Jordan Valley. That was basically their natural geopolitical ambit. And that happens to be the land where the Jewish people, the Israelites, are living as well. And they say they were liberated from being slaves of Egypt, but you don't actually have to be in Egypt to be slaves of Egypt when the Egyptian Empire is covering everything from Egypt up to the Lebanese mountains. Okay? There is, of course, no historical evidence either for Hebrews present in Egypt, for the destruction of the entire Egyptian army, which would have left a mark. Egypt would have collapsed economically and politically if Pharaoh and all his horses had been cast into the sea. There's also absolutely no evidence of 6 million Hebrew slaves spending 40 years walking through the desert and not once dropping a piece of litter. Okay? Not once dropping a piece of pottery. Not once dropping a flint knife. They were the first Boy Scouts. Okay? They respected the country code. Well, no, they didn't exist. Okay? And of course, Moses is itself an Egyptian name, not a Hebrew name. So there's another interesting sub-story going on there. But it's impossible to date it, and those who try end up with different dates at different points in time, but it doesn't fit together all that well. It also doesn't fit with the archaeological data from inside Palestine that says that the The villages and the houses we identify as Israelite houses are culturally indistinguishable from the Canaanite houses. They did not come from somewhere else. They did not speak a different language. They did not worship other gods. They had exactly the same crockery. Okay? There's something about them that made them different, but it wasn't where they came from. Which really gets us more to the Joshua story. When it comes to the story of the conquest, which we typically date around 1200 BCE, half the places Joshua conquered didn't exist in the 12th century, and others that were destroyed earlier, some were destroyed later, some weren't destroyed at all. So the story of the 12 tribes marching in, taking over the country, and massacring all the local inhabitants, by and large, mercifully, is not a historical account. David, we must be getting close, don't you reckon? Well, David probably did exist, but he was a local chief. He wasn't the ruler of a kingdom stretching from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. And we have, A, because no one else in the world had ever heard of him and he would have left the mark. B, because actually you can't run an empire of that size from a tiny bit of resource base that you'd have in Palestine. You're just not going to have enough soldiers. You're just not going to have enough agriculture. You're not on the trade routes. You're not a maritime power. You just are not going to have the technical and military resources to build an empire based in Jerusalem. Can't be done. Okay? That's not to say David didn't exist, but his CV has been embellished to make him this amazing guy. Just in the last few weeks at Bethsaida, we've uncovered the what we call the stratum 6 sort of level from the excavations of Bethsaida, a massive fortified Aramean city dating to about 1100 and continuously occupied down to 731. So never mind the about. We can actually give an exact date. Okay. David never conquered that place. And if he didn't conquer Bethsaida, he certainly hadn't conquered Damascus, and so on. Okay? Now, a really lovely couple we've all heard about, Ahab and Jezebel. Let me remind you, Ahab was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, according to the story. He's from the same time as Elijah. He had a neighbour called Naboth who had a vineyard, who he wanted. And he'd married what we would now describe as a woman from Lebanon. She was a princess from Tyre, which is one of the cities on the south coast of Lebanon. And Jezebel, of course, has become a label. Nobody wants to be called a Jezebel. She's such a Jezebel. Okay? Not a nice person. Okay? So she's become a cultural icon all around the world. Are we dealing with history yet? Any bids? Well, let me put you out of your misery. Yes. We can put exact dates on the reign of Ahab. That does not mean that Jezebel did all the things attributed to her, for the reasons attributed to her, but we can actually date these people, and equally importantly, the neighbouring kingdoms refer to battles with King Ahab and how they had defeated Ahab and so on. So we're starting to get kind of reports from other powers reflecting the existence of a powerful city-state in the north of Palestine called Samaria, or Israel, and the ruler was Ahab and his wife was Jezebel. So finally we're getting into history. Okay? Everything before that may have historical elements in it, but we can't date it, we can't locate it, we can't verify that those people and those things occurred. But a lot of the Bible story is stuff earlier than 870. And of course the other thing this is telling us, but it's not obvious, the really important part was not Jerusalem and the kingdom in the south. Okay, the really important, the vibrant, politically successful, culturally successful entity was Israel, which is the name for the kingdom in the north. Judea was just a little province, basically managed from Samaria. They decided who became the king in Jerusalem. The king in Jerusalem was their vassal. That's not how the Bible tells the story, of course. Okay?
Excuse me, Greg. So are those records from on cuneiform tablets?
About Ahab and Jezebel.
Yes.
These are texts from the Damascus, from the Aramean. So they're both they're mostly inscriptions on stone.
Oh, okay.
So it's down to the 9th century, the middle of the 9th century BC. We start to get to historical data. Okay. Now that has implications then. Well, we don't ignore everything else, but we've got to treat it as something other than history. Powerful stories, formative stories, stories that help ancient Israel, and particularly Judah. Because remember, at the end of the day, even though the really successful kingdom was the kingdom of Israel, the people that gave us the Bible were the people from Jerusalem, not the people from Samaria. And what do the people from Jerusalem tell us about the people in Samaria? They're half-breeds, they worship a golden calf, they're terrible, you don't want anything to do with them. Well, hang on, Elijah was one of them, and his name says, Yahweh is my God. Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, the great prophets of the 8th century and the 9th century are religious leaders from the north. Okay? But after the Assyrians came through and wiped out the north in 731 and then totally destroyed Samaria in 722, refugees from the north fled south, found refuge in Jerusalem. Your story becomes my story. I now claim to be Israel. Okay? And all the promises to Israel are now promises to Judah. Okay? So we get a stealing of the story and a reshaping of the story to glorify Jerusalem and to denigrate Samaria, Israel. They had their golden calves. What did the people in Jerusalem have, by the way? What did they have on the wall of the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem? A dirty, big, bronze snake. Nehushtan was his name. Okay? Oh, that's okay. That's not an idol. Okay? We've had that since Moses was a boy. But the golden calf, no, that's an idol. How convenient. My bronze snake is okay. Your golden calf is bad. Okay? We play that game still, all around Grafton, from one Christian church to another. So, the genre. So what do we find? This goes back to Peter's question. What do we find? Well, we do find royal archives, because it's propaganda. Now, archives can be exaggerated. They can claim victories that were not quite as big. They might claim there were many more thousand people there in front of the Lincoln Memorial than were actually there. They might extol the accomplishments of the US Army in capturing all the airports in North America in 1776. Okay, there could be a little bit of exaggeration here and there when the teleprompter collapses, but royal archives are publicly funded monuments which celebrate achievements or purported achievements. When they say one of the things I did was I defeated Ahab and I imposed a heavy tribute on him, then that means we've got evidence that Ahab must have existed, irrespective of whether or not he was really defeated by the sort of king of Damascus. So we have royal archives. We have the chronicles, and these tend to be clay tablets in the case of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and later on they become documents, parchments and so on, because any government is going to keep records. They usually get lost. They either get burnt in a fire, because sooner or later every house burns down, or they get eaten by cockroaches. Okay? So we don't have copies of the annals of the kings of Judah. What we do have, when they had these documents and they rolled them up to put them on the shelf, they tied a string around them and they put a little soft sort of label made of pottery on it with to be a seal. It's what's called a bulla. Now, what we've got in the case of the the city of David in Jerusalem, is we have lots of bullae. We don't have the documents; they've been destroyed in a fire. But we've got so the papers have gone, but the paper clips are still there. So we know there was once upon a time an archive here, but all we've got is the paperclip. We don't have the documents. We've got the legends that people tell, okay, and often the legends will be ways of making sense of relationships between different tribes, like finding a way for the tribe of Moab and so on to be fitted into the Abraham story because of Lot's sexual intercourse with his daughters, which is a way of fitting them in but also giving them a really bad rap at the same time. They're black sheep, always have been. Yeah? We have saga tends to be long stories that develop over time. Of course, we have genealogies, and then we get the development of stories, and stories might include in them pieces of legend, pieces of saga, and so on, but a story has a bigger structure. And there are various traditional ways of telling stories in the ancient Jewish world. And of course, ballads. People would sing songs about the ancestors. In the Greek world, Homer's work is the sort of classic example of that, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the ballads. And they tell the story of conflicts between different characters. They introduce mythic elements, but they're also remembering lost cities, like Troy was discovered because someone took the ancient ballad seriously enough to go and look for the spot. Similarly, much more recently, we found the Byzantine baptism church on the spot where John the Baptist was baptizing, because it's shown on the a map, and it had been lost for hundreds of years. But eventually, someone said, "Well, let's go and dig," and sure enough, it's there. Okay, been lost for hundreds of years, but it was recovered because people took the ancient stories, the maps, the ballads, and so on, literally. And then there's myth. Myths tend to be stories where the characters in the story are non-human characters, gods, fairies, demons, talking animals like snakes and donkeys and so on, that have mythical, supernatural powers. Okay? Now, of course, one of the problems is we've tended to assume in the past that my miracles are things that really happened, and your miracles are just myths. They're not things that really happened. When we call something a myth, we tend to mean that's not true. But actually, a myth is a story which is true because it tells you how the world is. So when we talk about the Anzac myth, we're not saying there were no Anzacs in Gallipoli. We're saying that the story of Anzac has become a story of mythic or epic proportions that in a way sets the benchmark for future generations, particularly of Australian soldiers, to conduct themselves, and maybe for Australians more generally conduct ourselves. So when we put on our Western hats and start looking at these stories, we're typically going to start saying, if there's lots of stuff in here that requires supernatural intervention, that's probably not a real story, in that that's not what happens every day of the week. Okay? So we came out of a world where supernatural was invoked repeatedly to explain things which were inexplicable. We're now in a world where we can explain so much more, and one of the dangers is if we say, oh yes, but there's still that little bit over here that you can't explain, God did that. Well, in 5 years' time, we'll probably have an explanation for that, and the so-called God of the gaps gets smaller and smaller. Okay? So that's a defensive strategy that's not going to work well. So we're going to say, how much is this story about the supernatural? How much is it about the real world? Okay. Like, if it's a story about a magic stone falling out of heaven, most of us are not going to take it seriously, whether it's the stone in Mecca or whether it's the ancient stone at the Temple of Athena in Ephesus. We just don't buy stories about heavenly stones falling out of the sky and becoming the centerpiece of worship. That's not how, we don't think God works that way. So we don't buy those sort of stories. Plausibility. We're going to be asking a question like, how can things like that really happen? Is it even plausible for something like that to happen? Is it plausible, for example, for the waters of the Red Sea to be divided, stacked up on either side, dry land created in the middle, where several million Hebrews can walk across and not even be in mud? Okay, they're not pulling their feet through the mud because it's totally dry and firm. And then a little bit later, when the Pharaoh and his army chase them down the same track, they get bogged. Then the waters come back on top of them. And our typical response is, I have a bridge, which I'm willing to sell for you for a very reasonable price. Would you like to buy it? I mean, that's just not a plausible story. So we'll look for some other explanation. And there are various ways we do that. We shift the miracle and we make it smaller. We say, oh, they didn't mean the Red Sea, they meant the Reed Sea. And it's just like the swampy stuff at the north of the Gulf of Suez. So we've just downsized the miracle from this fantastic event to a bunch of runaway slaves tiptoeing through the mud at the swamp. And we say, isn't God marvellous? I prefer the old story, actually. I don't think it happened, but it's a much better story than the explanations that biblical scholars give. Then there's probability. Even if something is plausible, is it probable? In other words, this is exactly the process we use in a court of law. Okay? You can't really invoke the fairies told me to do it when you're before the judge. If your explanation is quite implausible, you're not really going to convince the jury. And even if it is plausible, how probable is it that that's what happened? Okay? So it's a slightly different question. Then we look at parallels, like, for example, the fact that flood stories occur in many, many different places around the world, but of course they only occur in places where floods happen. Great river valleys. They don't happen on top of the mountains of Nepal. They don't happen in places where you don't have floods. You find stories about great floods in flood country. You find stories about being lost in the sea in a terrible storm and being rescued from shipwreck, not in the middle of the desert, but in maritime societies who go to the sea in little boats. Okay, so these stories are often particular to given cultures, different societies. And sometimes we can trace the influence, like we know that the cultural influence of Egypt was all over Canaan, but we also know that periodically there were waves of people coming into Canaan or Palestine who'd come from the east and who brought with them cultural traditions about floods and so on, because floods are not part of the life on the coast of Palestine. Okay? You might get a flood in the Jordan River, but you're not going to get floods on the coast of Palestine. So we're looking for possibilities of cultural transfer as well as stories that only make sense. Then we look for, is there any evidence that this bit of literature over here has influenced this bit of literature here? Now, when we're in the Greek world, yes, because anybody who could read and write in the Greek and Roman world had learnt to read and write by studying Homer. So whereas we did, Tom and Dick and so on, and Tom and Dora, whatever it was, Dick and Dora, I think it might have been actually. If you could read and write something like Mark's Gospel in the first century, then you had been trained on Homer. So the metaphors and the allusions and the structures which come out of Homer are indeed found in Mark. Okay? Including shipwrecks and being lost at the sea and calming the storm and the pig running down over the cliff and so on. All of these stories are found in Homer. And anybody who could write Mark's Gospel would have learnt to read and write using Homer. Then we have deliberate revisionist literature. So the book of Chronicles sets out to rewrite the history from Samuel and Kings. And in the process, write the northern kingdom out of the story. So the story becomes all about Jerusalem and its temple. Shock horror. Of course it does. Or in Luke's case, as I alluded in a throwaway line earlier, Luke tells us in that opening paragraph of Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, there have been lots of other people who've tried their hand at writing Gospels. Now I'm going to tell you how it really was. In other words, I'm not happy with Matthew. I'm not happy with Mark. I'm not happy with John. Dear Theophilus, I'm going to tell you how it really was. And I'm expecting all these other ones to go out of print. Now, he was wrong. The church kept all of them. Okay? But Luke expected his orderly account, as he calls it, to replace the disorderly accounts, the jumbled accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we call this, when you're publishing something, deliberately to revise and to update. Then we look for evidence from archaeology. Can we find evidence of a giant flood? And can we date all those flood silt layers to the same period? Okay. What do we learn about the relationship between Israel and Jerusalem in the 9th, 8th century and so on? What do we find at Bethsaida? What do we find wherever? So archaeology helps us to see what's going on. So, for example, the fact that at Bethsaida we have found some Egyptian seals, by which I don't mean animals that live by the water. I mean, seals that are used by bureaucrats to stamp a wax or a pottery clay bulla. The fact that we've found 3 or 4 of these Egyptian seals in the storage area just inside the city gates, which was the city bank, that makes sense because that was the northeast extremity of Egyptian control. And they sometimes had to use Egyptian government forms, if you like. And then of course, we have what's called critical historiography. So we look at all the ancient stories, we look at what we have from the Greeks, what we have from other ancient writers, and we try to construct a critically nuanced account of what probably has happened. And so, for example, we need to, and some people are doing this, instead of just writing a history about the Jewish people in Canaan, which is what the Old Testament encourages to do, okay, scholars are now saying, well, let's write a history of Canaan. Okay, there'll be a Jewish part in that story, but let's try to reconstruct what was actually happening north of Egypt, south of Lebanon, during the 2nd millennium and the 1st millennium BC. So you get a different way of telling history, and then this wonderful, glorious kingdoms of David and Solomon, we realise actually didn't exist and could not exist because there just weren't enough people living there to form an army which could take on the Babylonians and the Egyptians at the same time. Okay. So, speaking of time, we've come to realise that when we're talking about ancient history, we're dealing with time in 3 different ways, like the old water meter that has, or the power meter for that matter, that, there are some things that are just moving really, really slowly. You can stand there for quite a while and the dial doesn't appear to move. There's another dial that's moving, you can watch it, it's definitely moving. And there's another one that's going like that, okay? So the longue durée are the things that have always been there. The Mediterranean Sea, the Tigris River, the Euphrates River, the Nile River, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba, the desert, although the desert in North Africa is actually a much more modern creation, the mountains in southern Lebanon, the mountains in Turkey, Anatolia, across the top of Mesopotamia, the structures of Greece, and so on. Okay, these are things that have always been there. And so we can study those, and they give us this is how the stage is set up for human culture. Okay. The fact that Egypt is not next door to India, but they did like to trade. So, again, you get trade routes on land and on water between the Far East and South Asia and the Mediterranean. That's just the way things are. Then you get middle time, and middle time tends to last 500 or 600 years at a time, and it's very much to do with a cultural epoch. It's going to reflect changes in technology. It's going to reflect the political structures, particular rulers and dynasties staying in power for maybe several hundred years at a time, like the Mamluk period, the Ottoman period, the Hellenistic period, the Roman Empire, etc. And in these periods, there will be particular combinations of religion and family life and culture and so on. For example, coins were only invented in 600 BC. But coins slowly spread everywhere because they were a convenient tool for merchandise, for trading. So we can see that prior to 600, there's going to be a different way of sharing wealth. Once you've got coins, you've got a different set of options. And then you come down to what happened today. Who was sitting in church next to you? What did you have for breakfast? What was the name of that Jewish woman from a village in Galilee who was raped by a Roman soldier? Stuff that actually happened today on a daily basis. And that's where real life is, but it's almost impossible to capture. Archaeologists rarely, even if we found, despite Monty Python and the Holy Grail, even if we found the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, would we know it was the cup used by, he must have used a cup, a particular cup. But it just went back into the cupboard afterwards. Jesus didn't say to Peter, hey Pete, you better have this one for the Vatican Museum. Okay? That's not what happens in real life. So you can see kind of why we find the leftover, we might find a pair of gold earrings in a house at Bethsaida. So we know the women who lived in the village liked jewellery, but we don't know the name of the woman who wore it. We don't know what party she was going to when she put the earrings on. But we can go up a level and say, so there were goldsmiths. And there's no gold around here, so there must have been an international trading system to bring gold in, blah, blah, blah. So you can see how these three different layers of history interact with each other. So then it comes to imagination. If it's true that the stories we tell each other are the way we make meaning, then what's really, really important is not whether something happened, but in what way is it true for us. And there's this lovely saying which is quoted by Marcus Borg in one of his books. I'll come back to it again in a second. But one of the traditional ways for North American storytellers to begin their story is not once upon a time in a faraway land. That's our way of starting our story. But now I don't know if it happened this way or not, but I know this story is true, which is a lovely way to introduce a story. And if you want a one-liner to take away, don't mortgage truth to historicity. Okay? Don't mortgage truth to historicity. Remember that, the rest I've said today doesn't matter. So, we know there's lots of stuff in the Bible that is just plain made up, and we're okay with that. The parables of Jesus did not happen. They're made up stories. Okay? Even the Good Samaritan. I'm not going to steal your thunder for next week. There was no guy walking along the road through the Wadi Kelp who was beaten up by robbers, left for dead, passed by a priest and a Levite till a Samaritan came and helped him. That is a made-up story. Okay? That Jesus made up to teach a point. Metaphors. Even something like the empire of God is a metaphor. The Lord is my shepherd. Okay? I'm not a sheep. I may be a goat, but I'm not a sheep. Okay? But that's a metaphor that says something about a relationship of trust and goodwill and providence. Symbols. The symbolism of bread and wine and water and mountains and so much more. Okay? They have a truth value which is not equal to their historicity. Poetry. Poetry works on all sorts of levels, and of course the Psalms in particular are full of poetry, but so are the prophets. The prophets often spoke in poetry. That's interesting. Okay? It's almost like a ballad, but it was a ballad with a message. It was more about judgment and so on most of the time. And then, of course, there are stories that are told, not because they're what happened, but because the stories. Like there were thousands of people who walked the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, and a lot of them got beaten up and robbed. Okay, that sort of thing happened all the time. But the Samaritan is still a story Jesus made up. In terms of stories, then we get things like, well, what about the 7 days of creation? Just happens to be a week. And guess what? Day 7 is Shabbat, when nobody's allowed to do any work, not even God. Okay? We should never have taken that story literally. It's obviously a poetic story telling the idea that God has made everything and everything made by God is good, and it all happened in a week, and Shabbat is part of the order of creation. Having a day off, having a rest day is part of the order of creation. Beautiful story, but when we literalize it, it becomes nonsensical. 10 Commandments. It's actually 11 if you read it closely. F1. There are 5 for God, there are 5 for others, and there's one about being nice to mum and dad in the middle, which kind of snuck in. But you can see what's going on there. Here are 5 tips for getting on with God. Here are 5 tips for getting on with your neighbours. Like don't murder, don't tell lies, no adultery, don't be jealous of their assets, etc., etc. Okay, no false witness, etc. So it's not that God only had 10 commandments to give Moses, but this is a really handy teaching tool. The Sermon on the Mount, otherwise known as the Sermon on the Mount, of course, didn't happen. Okay, in December, I'll take some of you to a beautiful church, marking the spot where Jesus did not give the Sermon on the Mount. But it's a great view of the lake. So it's a great place to stick a church and remember the Beatitudes. Okay? But in Luke's Gospel, everything we find on the Sermon on the Mount happens somewhere else and mostly on the flat, not up a hill. In other words, the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew saying, so Moses was a teacher who went up the mountain to get wisdom from God. Jesus is a teacher who goes up the mountain to give us wisdom from God. Okay? Matthew created the Sermon on the Mount as a teaching mechanism to get a message across to his Jewish audience. Final one, Luke's infancy story. Luke has read Matthew and he goes, nah, don't like that story. I'm going to tell it this way. Imagine there were 2 boys and one of them is going to become the ruler of the world. Okay? They're both going to have miraculous births. Their parents are both going to burst into poetic song praising God's glory. They're both going to be named and taken to the temple to be circumcised and so on. But only one of these boys is going to become the ruler of the universe. And that's what you find in the last part of Luke chapter 2. And of course it's Jesus, not John the Baptist. Now that story makes sense in a Roman world where Romulus and Remus, the twins, were the 2 boys, one of whom is going to become the founder of Rome. See what Luke is doing. He's re-spinning the story, remixing the story so it works for his audience. And it's a wonderful story. Not to be mistaken, of course, for history and so on. Okay, time is up. So, just quickly wrapping up. Marcus Ball talks about 3 stages of faith. He talks about pre-critical naivete. When we're kids, we just believe everything we're told. There are fairies at the bottom of the garden, there are monsters under the bed, and mum and dad are looking after us. And Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy both come at the appropriate time. When we were just come back from the US and our oldest daughter Claire was just at year 2 level where teeth are popping out. So one night tooth came out, fair enough. So we waited till the girls were asleep. And then of course we had to do our duty. So we went in to find the tooth. It was meant to be under a cup saucer on a table next to Claire's bed. I picked up, there's a note. Dear Tooth Fairy, you'll have to look in the kitchen. So we sort of go outside the room, fall about the lounge room laughing. She set us on Wild goose chase all around the house. And even I just bursting with laughter, trying not to wake the girls. Eventually we found the tooth was tied up in a handkerchief, which was tied to her wrist with a piece of string. But she was so sound asleep, okay. So the tooth fairy, that's pre-critical naivete. I'll come back to that in a minute. Critical thinking is when we're about 8 or 9 or 10 and we start to say, but did that really happen? Are there really tooth fairy? Again, same house, actually, just a year or a few months later even. I'm working in my study. Claire and Lizzie turn up at the door. We want our teeth back. I said, really? You want your teeth back? Yes, we know you're the tooth fairy. Well, that's interesting, because if you got the teeth back, then the tooth fairy would never come again. The older one goes, come with me. A few minutes later, you can keep the teeth. Troublesome girls. Okay? Critical thinking. Beginning to work out what's really happening. When they stop believing in Santa Claus, stop believing in Tooth Fairy, but still want the benefits. Still put the stocking out. Still put the tooth out. Post-critical naivete, when you've grown through all that, you realise it didn't really happen, but you also realise there's something magical in this. When I am the tooth fairy, and there's a magic in being the tooth fairy in a little person's life. I am Santa Claus. Okay? That story is coming to life in me. And if I choose to be the Grinch who stole Christmas, then I'm not just missing out on that myself, I'm also depriving others. And so there's this little definition from Marcus Paul. Post-critical naivete is the ability to hear the biblical stories once again as true stories, even as one knows they may not be factually true, and that their truth does not depend on their factuality. This way of hearing sacred stories is widespread in pre-modern culture. In Arabia, traditional storytellers begin with, this was and this was not. Or as he says, favourite of mine is the way a Native American storyteller begins telling his tribe's story of creation. Now, I don't know if it happened this way or not, but I know this story is true. And Marcus wraps up by saying, if you can get your mind around that statement, then you know what post-critical naivete is.